and sullied by us humans, sex is a very good part of human life.
We live our lives in a great deal of hypocrisy, telling our children to do one thing while we do something else.
The quest for control. We all would love it if our lives were a bit more controllable.
Discussions within the Christian community about these questions will be primary for the survival of the Christian community.
We live in a strange new world today in which reproductive technologies are ravaging as well as replenishing our families. Consider this latest update of the traditional family portrait. Now, as you can see, there's baby X in the first row, and then the second row, the surrogate mother, the foster father, the adoptive mother, the biological father, the foster mother, and the guardian. And then in the third row are the attorneys. And you notice they're the only ones smiling in this scenario. Sam, that's there for you. I'm sure they're not Christian attorneys. It's just, okay.
I don't see any pins.
If we think that this picture is strange, it will rapidly become even stranger if we embark on the path of human cloning. In fact, developments in the cloning arena are already occurring extremely fast. I mean, this past spring marked just the first anniversary of the U.S. President's charge to the nation and to his National Bioethics Advisory Commission to give careful thought to how we should proceed with regard to human cloning. Attention to this issue was spurred by the reported cloning of a mammal, a sheep, in a new way that had not been done before. It was not just the splitting of an early stage embryo to produce twins. It was bringing into the world an exact genetic replica of an already existing being. The technique is referred to as nuclear transfer or nuclear transplantation because it involves transferring the nucleus, and thus the genetic material, from the cell of an existing being to an egg cell in order to replace the egg cell's nucleus. Stimulated to divide by the application of electrical energy, this egg is guided by its new genetic material to develop into a being that is genetically identical to the being from which the nucleus was taken. This process was reportedly carried out in a sheep to produce the clone called Dolly. But attention has quickly shifted to the prospects for cloning human beings, by which I will mean here cloning by nuclear transfer. Now, already people are seeing dollar signs and opportunities for notoriety through this practice. Earlier this year, scientist Richard Seed announced his intentions to set up a human clone clinic commercially here in the Chicago area, first of all, then in a number of locations around the country, and then in 5 or 6 locations around the world. Shortly after Seed's announcement, I was discussing this issue with Jim Childress, who was one of the members of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, and he lamented the lack of U.S. legislative action and decision-making in this whole area of human cloning, especially at the federal level. However, interestingly, he took heart, somewhat ironically, in Richard Seed's proposed human cloning business, because he noted that before Barry Jacobs proposed establishing a business related to selling organs for transplant, there had been a lot of legislative discussion on that issue, but it took an actual proposal for commercialization to provoke federal legislation on the subject. Well, outside the U.S. context, of course, there has been a more aggressive response in certain quarters. In January of 1998, a ban on human cloning was signed, for example, by 19 European countries. Of course, before taking legal action, it is wise to be clear about the ethics of the situation. And that's the stage and the point at which we find ourselves in today. The first question becomes, why clone human beings? Now, before answering that, a word about terminology here. Is it appropriate to call someone who has been produced through cloning a clone? Now, although people have different views on this subject, and we could discuss it, I would say yes, it is okay, as long as there does not become a stigma attached to the term that is not attached to other more cumbersome expressions we might use, like a person who is the result of cloning, or someone created through the use of somatic cell nuclear transfer. Because, of course, we call somebody from Italy an Italian, no disrespect intended, and so it can be, at least for now, with regard to the term clone. So, why clone humans? That's the fundamental question here. Well, to be honest, people are a little squeamish about the prospect. That may be the best way of putting it. And one way to illustrate that is with regard to Farmer Jones here. If you met Farmer Jones walking down the street or outside on the lawn or whatever, he's a nice enough guy, and you might engage him in conversation, etc. But there's something about the fact if you were walking along and you met up with 5 Farmer Jones, the reaction is a little bit different, definitely, at the gut level. Leon Cass has written persuasively about the importance of taking and understanding this squeamishness seriously. Yet at the same time as we have that reaction, there's something terribly intriguing about human cloning. And I think recent media portrayals help to explain the allure here. You know, there was the movie The Boys from Brazil about the prospect of cloning and bringing back Adolf Hitler. There was the novel Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, in which clones were created to fulfill undesirable roles in society. There was the movie Blade Runner in the early 80s, which questioned whether human clones were really persons or more like machines. And then more recently, the movie Multiplicity, that perhaps really gets to the heart of the public allure here. You know, it pictures that harried man who jumps at the chance to have a number of versions of him brought into existence. I mean, there's the version of him that could be at home and take care of all those chores and responsibilities, and then there's the version of him that could be at work and take care of all those responsibilities and leave him freer for various leisure pursuits that he doesn't have the time for. Now, if you've ever had a busy day, if it was difficult even to break away to come to this conference, then perhaps you can indeed appreciate the allure and the attractiveness of that possibility. Now, in Chicago, here, there's a fascination, in particular, with the idea of a basketball team made up of 5 Michael Jordans. Can you imagine that? A basketball team with 5 Michael Jordans? But even more fascinating is the idea of a basketball team with 5 Dennis Rodmans on it. I mean, the possible combinations of hair color alone is staggering. Now, many more people are excited about the prospect of something like cloning a Mother Teresa, perhaps, than a basketball star. And you have here, in a sense, a pithy, summarized version of the case for human cloning. And you may recognize some of those figures up there. You also see getting put forward in a pithy way the case against human cloning. Now, I'm sure the first thing that'll happen when we do this is that people will start arguing about whether the right people were put up for our heroes to be cloned, or whether the wrong people were put up with regard to the case against human cloning. But in any case, I think that's not the issue. Of course, human cloning is not photocopying. That's, of course, a major public misconception in some quarters. You're not producing identical copies, multiple copies of those who were our heroes. If our heroes' clones started growing today, and remember, this starts with an embryo, not a full-blown human being, they would not grow up to be our heroes. Our heroes are who they are, not just because of their DNA and genetic material. They, like us, are shaped by their genetics and by their environment. And even more, people have a spiritual capacity to evaluate and alter either or both of their environment and their genetics. Each clone would experience unique environmental conditions and have unique spiritual capabilities. They'd be different people. So if the popular fascination with cloning is not really a legitimate justification, then we have to go back to the original question: why clone human beings? Well, I would suggest to you that if you talk to people, if you look through the literature, if you consider the arguments, there really are three core justifications here that are being put forward that we really have to seriously consider in order to answer that fundamental bioethical question. There is the utility justification, the autonomy justification, and the destiny justification. And that's what I'd like to look at this afternoon. The first two of those justifications reflect ways of thinking that are highly influential in the United States and various other parts of the world today. So we have to carefully evaluate them if we're going to take the issue seriously. The third justification here opens the door to more explicitly biblical theological reflection. And so we certainly need to be engaged in that as well. Now, the first type of justification then is the utility justification. According to a utility justification, what matters in assessing a practice is whether or not it'll be beneficial, whether or not it will enhance human well-being. Now, various scenarios have been put forward to illustrate the beneficial potential of human cloning. And let me just remind you of 6 of the examples that have been put forward. First of all, by having clones, people can, in some measure, have more of themselves in the world, to make a greater impact on the world in which they live. Secondly, parents could replace a dying child with a genetically identical new child. Thirdly, parents could produce a clone of a sick child in order to provide bone marrow or other bodily elements that could be produced with relatively limited harm or risk to the clone, but also have the potential of saving the sick child. Fourthly, parents, both of whom have a lethal recessive gene, could produce a child by cloning, rather than risking the 1 in 4 chance that their child would be saddled with an early death, or rather than going through, for example, the use of donor sperm or eggs in an in vitro fertilization process. Fifthly, from a broader social perspective, clones could be produced to provide organs for transplant. Transplants that could jeopardize and even end the clone's life, but could help more people in the process. And sixthly, clones could also be produced to benefit society in other ways, through unusually high or low mental capacity, for example, in order to engage in challenging problem solving or to engage in menial labor that the society needs done. The second major popular justification, as I noted, is the autonomy justification, which is an increasing favorite in the postmodern age in which we live. According to this justification, we ought to respect people's autonomy as a matter of principle. People's beliefs and values are too diverse to adopt any one particular set of them as normative for everybody in society. Society should do everything possible to enhance the ability of individuals and groups to pursue whatever they deem to be most important to them. Now, there are at least 3 types, 3 forms that an autonomy justification can take, and I'm sure you'll recognize them. First of all, there's just the notion of personal freedom. There's a strong commitment, especially in the United States, though elsewhere in the world, to the notion of human freedom, rooted in a variety of religious and secular traditions. Respect for people entails allowing them to make the important decisions that flow from their own personal values and beliefs and goals, rather than coercing them to live by a burdensome array of social requirements. Personal freedom, that's one important appeal here. A second form is reproductive choice. Reproductive decisions are particularly private and personal matters, which have huge implications for one's future responsibilities and one's well-being in general. Social intrusion into this realm is particularly odious and resisted by many in society. And a third form of the autonomy justification has to do with scientific inquiry. A high value has long been placed on protecting the value of scientific inquiry. More knowledge and better understanding enhance our capacity for making good decisions and enhance our ability to accomplish great things in the world. So, to summarize the autonomy justification, human cloning and the research necessary to make it possible should be allowed in order to respect personal freedom, reproductive choice, and scientific inquiry. Now, while the concern to take a look at these two justifications, let's look first of all at the utility justification. While the concern for utility is admirable in the utility justification, there are many serious problems with this form of justification. Most significantly, it's unworkable and it's dangerous. It's unworkable because it's impossible to know accurately how much utility cloning, or any other practice for that matter, will actually be over the long run. It's impossible to calculate all of the ways that a practice like cloning will affect all people in the world indefinitely into the future. As Ian Wilmot, the sheep cloner, has observed, quote, "Most of the things cloning will be used for have not yet been imagined," unquote. Moreover, it's impossible to compare the significance of every foreseeable consequence on the same scale of value. What happens in reality is that decision makers intuitively compare only those consequences that they're most concerned about. And this is an open invitation to bias and discrimination. But even more dangerous than that, there are no limits to what can be justified, no built-in protections for weak individuals or minority groups, such as for clones. People can be subjected to anything, the worst possible oppression or even death, as long as it's beneficial to the majority. Situations like Nazi Germany and U.S. slavery can be justified using this way of thinking. People are used fundamentally as means to achieve the ends of society or other people, according to this way of thinking, according to the utility justification. Now, we allow this kind of behavior and this way of thinking where animals and plants are in view. Cloning in animals and plants is done to achieve a product that will fulfill a purpose. Better milk, better grain, that sort of thing. But it's demeaning to use people in that way. Now, it's most obvious if we were to make clones with low intelligence intentionally, or low ambition in order to provide a supply of menial labor in society. But it's a similar problem fundamentally if we produce clones to provide transplantable organs. And even cloning a child who dies or who is about to die in order to remove the parent's grief is a problem for the same sort of reasoning and way of thinking, as if the clone could actually be the same person, the same child that's been lost. Just not the case. So a utility type of justification, I would suggest, is an insufficient basis for justifying a practice like cloning. In other words, showing that a good benefit will result, all of those various examples that I gave you earlier, just simply holding up an example and showing that a good benefit will result is not a sufficient argument to justify an action, cloning or whatever. Now, I think we know this intuitively already. We could cut up one person, cut them into parts, take their organs for transplant, and in the process save many lives as a result while losing only one in the process. But we don't do that, because if the action we take in order to achieve a benefit, even as important a benefit as saving many lives, if that action is itself fundamentally bad, fundamentally evil, then beneficial results simply are not enough to justify it. But there's more to say about the utility justification for human cloning. For even if it were an adequate type of justification, which it's not, it's far from clear that a utility justification would even justify human cloning. For all the consequences of allowing human cloning would have to be considered, not just the benefits of an exceptional situation. If you lift up one situation, say, see, isn't human cloning justified? Look at this scenario. Wouldn't it be justified here? If you want to take that type of justification, then what you're saying is, let's look at the benefits. And if you look at all of the benefits, all of the consequences that would play out, I would suggest to you that we would find that human cloning would not be justified even on those sorts of utilitarian grounds. Now, what are some of the consequences that we would need to be concerned about? Well, here's an interesting one. I recently heard about a public forum that was put on regarding human cloning. And at the beginning of that forum, a vote was taken for and against human cloning. And as the discussion of the ethical issues went on, and the fact emerged that males were no longer necessary for reproduction because females could just do it themselves with their own egg in the cloning process, a man in the front row who had voted for cloning suddenly raised his hand and asked if there could be a revote. Well, there are some factors like that that may strike others as not quite as serious as some of the other issues that are involved here. First of all, to allow cloning is to open the door to a much scarier enterprise, and that's the whole enterprise of genetic enhancement. Cloning involves producing a person with a particular genetic code because of the attractiveness or the usefulness of that code. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we're developing the genetic capabilities to shape the code in many different ways. If we open this door, we legitimate the entire enterprise of designing children to suit particular parental or social purposes. And as a researcher at the Council on Foreign Relations has commented, quote, Dolly is best understood as a drop in a towering wave of genetic research that is about to crash over us, unquote. A second consequence that we'd have to take into account if we're going to think that way is the idea that to spend the resources that would be necessary to spend on human cloning is not to spend them on other more worthwhile and more significant endeavors. There are simply more pressing social and medical needs than reproduction via cloning, especially given the other reproductive options that are available. Limited financial resources and the limited availability of the skills of researchers and clinicians would be diverted in the process from endeavors that would help more people, that would be even more beneficial. Now, if there was a surplus of resources available to pay for every technology or every treatment that was needed or desired by everybody, that would be one thing. But researching and practicing human cloning will result in serious suffering and loss of life because other pressing needs will not be met if we go that direction. So, what I'm suggesting here is that an open door to genetically designing human beings and a misallocation of limited resources are among the many other considerations that are a part of the consequences. Now, as I said, we would do better not to even attempt to justify human cloning based upon its consequences. But if we do, if we adopt that way of thinking, then we have to be honest and include all of the consequences, not just some emotionally appealing, specific, exceptional case that somebody would lift up in order to justify the practice. We return now to the other particularly popular ethical justification that I referred to earlier for human cloning, the autonomy justification. Now, while the concern for freedom and responsibility for one's own life is admirable, I mean, that's what is at the heart of this way of thinking, there are many serious problems with this form of justification. Most significantly, it's selfish and it's dangerous. The very term by which it's called underscores its selfishness. Autonomy, as you Greek scholars know, come from two core words, auto, nomos, self-law. The self is a moral law unto itself. Whatever I decide is morally right for me simply because I choose it, because I identify it as right for me. There's no need or encouragement in this way of justification to consider the well-being of others, for that's irrelevant as long as it doesn't matter to me. Now, although in theory I should respect the autonomy of others as I live out my own autonomy, in practice, an autonomous mindset predisposes me to be unconcerned about how my actions will affect other people. Really, I'm like the man who was waiting for the birth of his first child. And he was waiting not in the delivery room, he was out in the waiting room. And he was pacing back and forth, perspiring profusely, wringing his hands. Finally, after what seemed to him to be an eternity, a nurse poked her head through the door and said, "Congratulations, sir, you have a baby girl." To which he immediately responded, "Thank God it's a girl. At least she'll never have to go through what I've just been through." Now, we smile, perhaps even laugh, when we see the raw, autonomous perspective lived out in someone's life. But it's not so humorous when a social policy is based squarely upon it. Now, of course, as long as the people who are making autonomous choices happen to have a good moral character that predisposes them to be concerned about the well-being of everyone else, then there will not be serious problems in practice. But with an autonomous ethics and autonomy ethics, there's no guarantee that decision makers will always be so well-intentioned. Consciously or unconsciously, selfish or other base motives intrude, and there's nothing to ensure that the well-being of others will be protected. When autonomy rules, scientists, family members, and others are predisposed to act on the basis of their own autonomous perspectives, and the risk to others is very real. Now, herein lies a danger that's very similar to what we talked about a few minutes ago with regard to the utility outlook. In an autonomy outlook, there are not, in practice, always protections for weak individuals or groups. No commitment to other core ethical concerns like justice or caring that could safeguard those who are at risk. So an autonomy type of justification is an insufficient basis for justifying a practice like cloning. In other words, showing that a freedom is curtailed is not a sufficient argument for justifying an action. Now, I think we've all learned this the hard way by allowing scientific inquiry to proceed through the decades unfettered at various points in history. The Nuremberg Code, for example, resulted from research activities that were allowed to occur because it was not recognized that there are other moral considerations that can be more important than autonomy directed to scientific or personal choices and decision making. The autonomy justification for human cloning, then, is flawed. But as with the utility justification, there's something more that we have to say here. For even if it were an adequate type of justification for human cloning, it's far from clear that autonomy, that respect for autonomy, would even justify human cloning. For the autonomy of all persons involved, including the people who are produced through cloning, would have to be considered if we're going to respect autonomy. Not just the autonomy of the researchers or the autonomy of the people who desire to have clones. Now, what else would need to be taken into account then if the autonomy of the clones was duly considered? Well, again, let me just note two of the most significant considerations here. First of all, there's the grave risk to the clone's life. In the process of cloning the sheep, Dolly, as you may know, 276 failed attempts occurred first including the death of several so-called defective clones. In the monkey cloning process that came out in the news shortly thereafter, a living embryo was actually intentionally destroyed in order to take the genetic material from its 8 cells in order to produce 8 new embryos. Human embryos and infants would be lost, whatever the process, and especially if you magnify this in a decentralized way so that the research is going on in many different locations simultaneously. The loss and the damage to human life would be considerable. Now, normally, only correcting a serious problem and the one on whom dangerous experiments are being done could possibly justify that sort of experimentation. But in the case of human cloning, there are no such benefits to the clone. The second additional concern regarding autonomy here is the issue that cloning radically weakens the family structure and the relationships of the child who is a clone. I mean, are the children who result from cloning the siblings or the children of their parents? Are they the children or the grandchildren of their grandparents? Now, unclarity at this point can easily impair the child's psychological and social well-being. In fact, their very sense of identity. Furthermore, who are the parents of the clone that's produced in the lab? Are the parents the donor of the genetic material? Are the parents the donor of the egg into whom the material is inserted? How about the scientist who manipulates the cells from the anonymous donors? Is that who the parent is? Who will provide the necessary love and care for the embryo, fetus, and then the child, especially when mistakes are made, and it's so much easier just to simply discard them. Cloning invokes images of manufacturing children according to specification, and the lack of acceptance this implies for children who fail to develop according to expectations, and the dominance that it introduces into the parent-child relationship are fundamentally at odds with the acceptance, the unconditional love, and the openness that's characteristic of good parenting. Quote, "It just doesn't make sense," unquote, to quote Ian Wilmot, the pioneer of the cloning of sheep, who strongly rejects and objects to human cloning. So, the grave risk to the clone's life, the radical weakening of the clone's family structure and relationships, both are highly relevant autonomy considerations. So what I'm saying is we would do better not to even embark on the direction of justifying our actions simply on the basis of autonomy. But if we do, we have to be honest about what all has to be included. We have to include the clone, first and foremost. Now, why is it that people typically might want to have a clone but not be a clone? Well, probably ultimately for the same reasons that the World Health Organization has labeled human cloning ethically unacceptable, and President Clinton has banned the use of federal funds for human cloning research. But as we noted at the outset, in addition to the utility and the autonomy justification, there's a third justification that we may need to spend a few minutes on in conclusion, and that's the destiny justification. According to this justification, it's part of our God-given destiny to exercise complete control over the reproductive process. In fact, Richard Seed, in one of his first in-depth interviews after announcing his intentions to embark upon the commercialized cloning of human beings, actually made this very argument, that it's a matter of human destiny before God. Now, no less a theologian than President Bill Clinton offered the opposite view when he issued the ban on human cloning. Rather than seeing cloning as human destiny, he rejected it as, quote, playing God. Now, who's right here? Well, to begin with, there are indeed problems with playing God in this context. Because note, God knows the future. He knows how every utilitarian consequence will work out, but people don't. God loves all persons equally, without bias, and is committed and able to understand and to protect the freedom of everyone. People are not. But there's much more at stake here. There's much more problematic theologically about utility and autonomy than just the notion that they involve playing God. The utility of cloning is that we can gain some benefit by producing clones, as we said a few minutes ago. But using other people without their consent for our ends is demeaning. People are made in the image of God. People have a God-given dignity that prevents us from using people basically as mere means to our ends. Consider also autonomy in theological perspective. Now, some notable ethicists, including Alan Verhey, who's been on the podium here already this morning, have helpfully observed that autonomy, understood in a particular way, is a legitimate biblical notion. As he notes in the book Bioethics and the Future of Medicine, under the sovereignty of God, the autonomy of the person can help ensure respect for and proper treatment of people who are made in the image of God. But there's a risk here, because the popular ethic of autonomy today has no place for God. It is autonomy over God, not autonomy under God. So our task is to affirm the critical importance of respect for human beings and for the freedom and responsibility of people to make the decisions that most profoundly affect their lives, but to point out that such freedom requires the framework in which autonomy is under God, not over God, in which respecting freedom is not just wishful or convenient thinking, which gives way as soon as individuals or societies as a whole have more to gain by disregarding it than by respecting it. It must be rooted in something that unavoidably is, in other words, in God, in the creation of human beings in the image of God. After all, whose work is creation? We worship God as creator. Now, of course, people are creative as well, being the images of God that they are. So, what is the difference between God's creation of human beings, as portrayed in the book of Genesis, and human procreation of human beings, as happens daily all over the world? In fact, as mandated by God also in the book of Genesis. Well, God's creation is, you know the expression, ex nihilo, out of nothing. Now that means in the first sense that God didn't just simply rearrange already existing materials. God actually brought into being a material universe where nothing even existed before. But God's creation ex nihilo suggests something more. It suggests that there was no agenda outside of himself that he was following. Nothing outside of himself that directed what the acceptable options were. When it came to the human dimension of his creation, he created us to be the way that he deemed best. It's no accident that we call what we do when we have babies procreation. Pro means for or forth. Now sure, we bring babies forth, but the deeper meaning here is for. We bring new human beings into the world for something or for someone. To be specific, we continue the line of beings for God in accordance with God's mandate, the mandate to humanity at the beginning to be fruitful and multiply. We also create for the people whom we bring into being. We help give them life. They are the ones who are the most affected by our actions, much more than society or we are ourselves. Now, what is particularly significant about this procreation, this creation for, is that it is a creation that's by its very nature subject to an outside agenda, to God's agenda primarily, and secondarily, with due respect to the needs of the person who is being brought into being. And in this light, the cloning mindset is hugely problematic. With unmitigated pride, it claims the right to create rather than just procreate. It looks neither to God for the way that God has intended human beings to be procreated and raised by fathers and mothers who are the secondary, i.e. the genetic source of their life, nor does it look primarily to the needs of the one being procreated. As we've seen, it looks primarily to the cloner's own preferences or to whatever value system in society they consider to be most important. In other words, those operating out of the cloning mindset see themselves as creator rather than procreator, the kind of aspiring to God that God has consistently chastised his people for, and for which he has ultimately wreaked havoc on many a society and civilization. As we can see, then, language means quite a lot in this context. And if we continue on this path, I would suggest, if our destiny is to clone ourselves, then our destiny is also ultimately to destroy ourselves, to destroy our very humanity. So claims about utility, autonomy, destiny are woefully inadequate to justify human cloning. In fact, a careful look at any of these justifications shows that they actually provide compelling reasons to reject human cloning. Now, to stand up and say so today may become more and more scary as the culture increasingly promotes production and self-assertion. It'll take bravery to insist anew that there is something more important at stake here. But such a brave new word is one that we must speak out of reverence for our Creator and our Lord.